The morning I watched 35 houses slide into what used to be my family's lake, I finally understood what my grandfather meant when he said, "Sometimes you have to flood the valley to save the mountain." I'm standing here today on what's left of the Riverside Ranch, 4 generations of my family's blood, sweat, and tears carved into this Texas hill country. But 6 months ago, this place looked very different. Where I'm standing right now, there were McMansions. Cookie-cutter houses with their perfect lawns and 3-car garages, built by people who thought they could steal a century of my family's legacy with paperwork and legal tricks. My name is Sarah Mitchell, and this is the story of how I took back what was never theirs to begin with. But to understand why I did what I did, why I opened that dam and watched millions of dollars in real estate disappear under 20 feet of rushing water, you need to know how this all started. You need to know about Margaret Hartwell, the HOA president who thought she was smarter than 100 years of Texas water law. You need to know about the night my grandfather's ghost probably smiled. Because what happened here wasn't just about property lines or water rights. It was about something deeper. Something that goes to the heart of what it means to belong somewhere, to have roots so deep they can't be torn up by greed or bureaucracy, or the kind of entitled arrogance that thinks money can buy anything. So let me take you back to where it all began. Back to the day when Margaret Hartwell first knocked on my door with her clipboard and her cold smile, thinking she was about to make the easiest land grab of her career. She had no idea she was about to go to war with a family that had been fighting for this land since before Texas was even a state. A CT1 SAT UP. It was a Tuesday morning in March when everything changed. I remember because I was sitting on my porch with my coffee, watching the sunrise paint the lake gold, when I heard the car doors slamming. 3 of them. I knew right then it wasn't going to be a good day. I had been living alone on the ranch for 2 years by then, ever since my father passed, and left me the 847 acres that had been in our family since 1847. Same number, different centuries. Daddy always said that was God's way of telling us this land was meant to be ours forever. The house sat on a rise overlooking Mitchell Lake, a spring-fed beauty that covered about 40 acres when the rains were good. My great-great-grandfather had dammed up Willow Creek back in 1889 to create it, and it had been the heart of our ranch ever since. The woman leading the group up my front steps was tall, sharp-featured, with steel-gray hair pulled back so tight it probably gave her headaches. She wore a cream-colored blazer despite the early morning warmth, and she carried herself like someone used to getting her way. Behind her trailed 2 men in ill-fitting suits, one clutching a briefcase like his life depended on it. "Mrs. Mitchell?" Her voice had that particular kind of authority that immediately put my back up. "I'm Margaret Hartwell, president of the Riverside Estates Homeowners Association. I believe you received our certified letters?" I set my coffee cup down slowly. I had received those letters. 3 of them, actually, each one more demanding than the last. Something about property assessments and compliance issues and a bunch of legal jargon that made my head spin. I'd thrown them all in the trash where they belonged. "I think there's been some mistake," I said, not bothering to get up from my rocking chair. "There's no HOA out here. This is private property, been in my family for over a century and a half." Margaret's smile was thin as a razor blade. "Oh, but there is now, dear. You see, the county approved our development last year. Riverside Estates. 35 luxury homes on 50 acres of prime lakefront property." She gestured toward the lake with a manicured hand. "Your lake." The words hit me like a physical blow. "My lake? What are you talking about?" "Mitchell Lake is on my property. It's been documented in county records since 1889. Actually, one of the suit-wearing men spoke up, consulting his briefcase. "There seems to have been an error in the historical surveying." Our recent geological assessment shows that the lake actually extends beyond your property lines into what is now county-designated development land. I stood up then, my hands shaking with a rage I hadn't felt since Daddy died. That lake was created by my great-great-grandfather. He built the dam. The water rights are recorded in the courthouse downtown. You can't just— We can, and we have, Margaret interrupted. The development is already underway. Construction begins next month. We're here today to discuss your options for compliance with HOA regulations, now that your property falls within our jurisdiction. I stared at her, trying to process what she was saying. My property falls within your jurisdiction? Lady, you are out of your damn mind. Margaret's expression didn't change, but something cold flickered in her eyes. Language, dear. We'll need to discuss appropriate community standards. Now, shall we step inside and review the homeowner guidelines? Get off my land. The words came out quiet, but they carried every ounce of Mitchell blood in my veins. Get off my land right now, before I call the sheriff. Oh, you won't be calling Sheriff Davidson, the second suit man said with a nasty little smile. He's aware of the situation. The county has been very cooperative with our development plans. That's when I knew this wasn't just some bureaucratic mix-up. This was planned, coordinated, and somehow they had people in official positions backing their play. Margaret reached into her blazer and pulled out a thick manila envelope. This contains your HOA welcome packet, including a full list of community standards, fee schedules, and architectural guidelines. You have 30 days to bring your property into compliance. That includes removing that rustic fencing, updating your home's exterior to meet community aesthetic standards, and of course, paying the appropriate fees and assessments. She held out the envelope, but I didn't take it. After a moment, she set it on the porch railing. Oh, and Mrs. Mitchell, she paused at the top of the porch steps. We'll be installing the community boat dock on the eastern shore of the lake next week. I trust that won't be a problem? I watched them walk back to their cars, my mind reeling. A community boat dock on my family's lake, where my grandfather had taught me to fish, where my parents had their wedding pictures taken, where I'd scattered Daddy's ashes just 2 years before. After they drove away, I grabbed that envelope and tore it open right there on the porch. What I found inside made my blood run cold. Architectural guidelines that would require me to tear down the 1,890s farmhouse and rebuild something that looked like every other cookie-cutter suburban home. Landscaping requirements that would mean cutting down the century-old oak trees. Peat restrictions that would force me to get rid of my horses and cattle. Monthly HOA fees of $800. But the worst part was at the bottom of the packet. A map showing the proposed development, 35 houses arranged in a perfect grid around what they were calling Lake Margaret, my family's Mitchell Lake, renamed after their HOA president. The houses were built right on the water's edge, with private docks and swimming areas. They were planning to turn my family's legacy into their personal playground. I sat there on that porch for 3 hours, reading through every page, and with each passing minute, I felt something hardening inside me like concrete. These people thought they could just walk onto land that had been in my family for 5 generations and claim it as their own. They thought they could rename our lake, regulate our lives, and force us to pay them for the privilege of living on our own property. They thought wrong. That night, I drove into town and stopped by the courthouse just before it closed. I needed to see those property records for myself, needed to understand how this was possible. The clerk, Mrs. Henderson, had known my family since she was a girl. "Oh, honey," she said. When I explained what had happened, I was wondering when you'd come in. There's been all sorts of people in here the last few months, looking at surveys and property records. Some of them had official county badges. She pulled out the files, and we spread them across the counter. The original 1,889 survey was clear as day. Mitchell Lake was entirely within our property boundaries, created by a dam built by James Mitchell on Willow Creek. The water rights were documented and registered. But there were new papers in the file. Recent ones. A revised geological survey dated just 6 months ago that claimed the original survey had been in error. A county assessment that reclassified the lake as community water resource. Legal documents signed by officials I'd never heard of. Mrs. Henderson, I said slowly, who requested these new surveys. She glanced around the empty courthouse, then leaned closer. Riverside Development Corporation. Same company that's building those houses. Sarah, I've been working here for 30 years, and I've never seen paperwork move through the system this fast. Usually takes years to revise property lines, especially on old ranch land. I drove home that night with a sick feeling in my stomach and a growing suspicion that this ran deeper than just some greedy HOA president. Someone with real power was behind this. Someone who could make county officials dance to their tune. But as I pulled into my driveway and saw the lake shimmering in the moonlight, I made myself a promise. I didn't know how yet, but I was going to fight this. This was Mitchell land, and it would stay Mitchell land even if I had to take on the whole damn county to make it happen. What I didn't know was that Margaret Hartwell was just getting started, and what she had planned for the next few months would test everything I thought I knew about justice, family loyalty, and how far someone will go to protect what's theirs. A CT2ES, CALATION. The harassment started exactly 1 week later. I was fixing a broken fence post near the lake when I heard the rumble of heavy machinery. 3 bulldozers and an excavator were rolling down the county road that bordered my eastern property line, followed by a convoy of pickup trucks and a mobile office trailer. I dropped my tools and ran toward them, waving my arms. The lead bulldozer stopped about 50 feet from my fence line, and a man in a hard hat climbed down from the cab. "You need to move those cattle," he shouted over the diesel noise. "We're breaking ground today." "The hell you are," I shouted back. "This is private property." The man consulted a clipboard. "Ma'am, according to our surveyor, we're on county development land. You need to move your livestock before someone gets hurt." That's when I saw Margaret Hartwell stepping out of one of the pickup trucks, wearing designer jeans and boots that had never seen a day of real work. She walked over with that same cold smile, carrying a rolled-up set of papers. "Good morning, Sarah. I hope you've had time to review the HOA packet." She unrolled what looked like an official survey map. "As you can see, the new property assessment shows that your eastern pasture actually extends into our development zone. We're going to need you to relocate your fencing about 200 yards west." I stared at the map. According to their survey, I was losing almost 60 acres, including the eastern shore of the lake, where they planned to build their community boat dock. "This is fraud," I said, my voice shaking with rage. "Pure and simple fraud. That land has been in my family for 5 generations." "Take it up with the county if you have concerns," Margaret replied smoothly. "In the meantime, we have a construction schedule to maintain. I'm sure you understand." What happened next still makes my blood boil when I think about it. While Margaret and I were arguing, the construction crew started working. Not on county land, on my land. They knocked down 50 feet of fence and began clearing trees that my great-grandfather had planted. I called the sheriff's department from my cell phone, standing right there, watching them destroy my property. The dispatcher told me a deputy would be out when one became available. 4 hours later, nobody had shown up. But the construction crew had accomplished what they came to do. They'd established what Margaret called adverse possession, a legal fancy term for squatters' rights. By working on the land and improving it, they were creating a legal claim that could be used in court. That evening, I drove to the sheriff's office in person. Sheriff Davidson, the same man Margaret's flunky had mentioned, was a thin, nervous guy who wouldn't meet my eyes when I explained what had happened. Mrs. Mitchell, this sounds like a civil matter. Property disputes aren't really law enforcement issues unless there's been a crime committed. They tore down my fence and cut down my trees. Well, now, if there's a legitimate survey dispute, then they might have been within their rights. You'd need to take it up with a lawyer. I left that office knowing I was on my own. The system that was supposed to protect property rights was either bought off or intimidated, and Margaret Hartwell was counting on me being too overwhelmed to fight back effectively. She was wrong about that, but she was right about one thing: I was overwhelmed. Over the next month, the harassment escalated in ways I never could have imagined. It started small deliveries of building supplies being dumped on my driveway, construction workers using my land as a shortcut to the development site, survey stakes being driven into my front yard with official-looking ribbons tied to them. Then it got personal. I came home from a trip to the feed store to find a county code enforcement officer parked in my driveway. He handed me a citation for agricultural violations, apparently. My horses were creating a public nuisance, and my barn needed to be brought up to county standards or demolished within 30 days. The fine was $12,000. 2 days later, I got a notice from the county health department. Someone had filed a complaint about my septic system, claiming it was contaminating the lake. I'd have to pay for a complete environmental assessment and possibly replace the entire system, another $15,000 minimum. The HOA letters kept coming too, each one more demanding than the last. Margaret's tone shifted from coldly professional to openly threatening. They were going to put lines on my property for unpaid HOA fees. They were going to fine me for every day my non-compliant structures remained standing. They were going to take me to court for willful violation of community standards. But the worst part was watching the development take shape around my lake. Every morning, I'd wake up to more construction noise, more trucks rumbling past my house, more of my family's land being carved up and sold off to strangers. The 35 houses rose from the earth like mushrooms after rain, identical beige stucco boxes with red tile roofs and tiny, perfectly manicured yards. Each one had a direct view of Mitchell Lake, and each one represented another nail in the coffin of my family's legacy. The buyers started moving in before construction was even finished. Suburban families in their SUVs, loading up their boats and jet skis for weekend lake adventures. They'd wave at me sometimes when I was working in my yard, probably thinking I was the hired help for the development company. None of them knew they were living on stolen land. Or if they did know, they didn't care. The breaking point came on a Thursday evening in late May. I was sitting on my porch after a long day of dealing with lawyers and county bureaucrats, trying to figure out how I was going to pay for all these fines and assessments, when I heard voices coming from the lake. I walked down to the shoreline and saw something that made my knees buckle. A group of the new homeowners had set up a barbecue party on the eastern shore, right where my grandfather used to keep his fishing boat. They had a portable stereo playing loud music, kids splashing in the swimming area where I'd learned to dive, and a banner strung between two trees that read "Welcome to Lake Margaret Community." But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part was seeing Margaret Hartwell herself, standing in the shallow water with a martini in her hand, pointing out different features of her lake to the new residents, like she was some kind of tour guide. "The water's spring-fed, so it stays clean year-round," I heard her saying. "And the fishing is excellent bass, catfish, even some trout in the deeper areas. We're so lucky to have this natural resource right in our backyard." Our natural resource. Our backyard. I must have made some sound because Margaret looked up and saw me standing there. For just a moment, her confident mask slipped, and I saw something like guilt flicker across her face. But it was gone so fast, I might have imagined it. "Oh, hello there, Sarah," she called out, her voice artificially bright. "We were just having a little community gathering. You're welcome to join us, of course, as long as you're ready to discuss your compliance timeline." The laughter and chatter died down as the other homeowners realized something was happening. They looked back and forth between Margaret and me, sensing the tension but not understanding it. I wanted to scream. I wanted to march down there and tell every single one of those people that they were trespassing on my family's land, that they'd been lied to and cheated just as much as I had. I wanted to grab Margaret Hartwell by her perfectly styled hair and drag her off my property. Instead, I turned around and walked back to my house. Because I knew that if I said what I was really thinking, if I did what every fiber of my being was screaming at me to do, Margaret would have me arrested for disturbing the peace. And then she'd have won. But as I sat on my porch that night, listening to their party continue until well past midnight, I made a decision that would change everything. I was done playing defense. It was time to dig deeper, to find out exactly who was behind this land grab and how they'd managed to pull it off. Because somewhere, in all those legal documents and county filings and revised surveys, there had to be a weakness, a crack in their perfect plan that I could exploit. What I discovered in the county courthouse basement the next morning would turn this whole situation upside down. And it would lead me to a revelation about Margaret Hartwell that she definitely didn't want me to know. Would you have been able to stay calm in that situation? Let me know in the comments, because what happened next tested every ounce of self-control I had left. I see T3DISCOVERY and REVERSAL. The county courthouse basement smelled like old paper and defeat. I'd been down there for 3 hours, going through boxes of historical documents that Mrs. Henderson had helped me locate when I found it. A folder marked Mitchell Ranch Water Rights, 1889-1923, that contained something I'd never seen before, my great-great-grandfather's original correspondence with the state of Texas about building the dam. James Mitchell hadn't just built that dam for irrigation and livestock. He'd built it under a specific provision of Texas water law that granted him permanent, irrevocable rights to control the flow of Willow Creek. Not just use the water, control it, including the right to divert it, store it, or even stop it completely if necessary. My hands were shaking as I photographed every page with my phone. According to these documents, the Mitchell family held what was called a senior appropriation right to Willow Creek, dated 1889. In Texas water law, that meant we had priority over any subsequent claims or developments, no matter what. But the most interesting document was a letter from the State Water Commission, dated 1923, confirming that the Mitchell Dam and Lake were considered critical infrastructure for drought management in the region. The letter specifically stated that any attempt to interfere with the Mitchell family's water rights would require direct approval from the state legislature. I sat back in that dusty basement chair and tried to process what this meant. Margaret Hartwell and her development company might own the land around the lake, but they didn't own the water. And without water, those 35 houses were just expensive boxes sitting next to a mud pit. But I needed more than just old paperwork. I needed to understand how they'd managed to fool the county officials, how they'd gotten their bogus surveys approved, and most importantly, who was bankrolling this whole operation. That's when I remembered something Margaret had said during that first confrontation. The county has been very cooperative with our development plans. Not the county officials, the county itself. Like they had some kind of institutional relationship. I spent the rest of that day in the county clerk's office, searching through development permits and business licenses. What I found made everything click into place. Riverside Development Corporation wasn't just some outside company that had bought land and decided to build houses. It was a subsidiary of Hartwell Holdings LLC, which was owned by Margaret Hartwell and her husband, Robert Hartwell, who just happened to be the county's largest private contractor. For the past 15 years, Hartwell Holdings had been winning bid after bid for county construction projects. Roads, bridges, government buildings, infrastructure improvements. They'd built half the county facilities currently in use, and they had ongoing contracts worth millions of dollars. But here's where it got really interesting. Robert Hartwell was also the brother-in-law of County Commissioner Jake Morrison, who had voted to approve the Riverside Estates development. And Commissioner Morrison's wife worked as a consultant for Hartwell Holdings, making twice her county salary for what the business filings described as community outreach. It was a classic case of small-town corruption hidden behind layers of LCs and family connections. The Hartwells had been using their county contracts to build political influence, and now they were cashing in on that influence to steal my family's land. I was so focused on photographing documents and taking notes that I didn't notice Mrs. Henderson standing behind me until she cleared her throat. "Find what you were looking for, honey?" I looked up at her weathered face and made a decision. Mrs. Henderson had worked in this courthouse for 30 years. She'd seen every dirty deal, every backroom handshake, every favor traded for political advantage. If anyone would know how deep this corruption went, it would be her. "Mrs. Henderson, can I ask you something off the record?" She glanced around the empty office and pulled up a chair. "Shoot." "The Hartwells. How long have they been pulling strings around here?" Her expression darkened. "Too long. Robert Hartwell's been gaming the bidding system since he got his first county contract back in '08. Always seems to know exactly what to bid, always has the right connections when decisions get made." And Margaret? That woman's got more ambition than sense. She moved here from Dallas about 10 years ago, married Robert for his money and his connections, and immediately started trying to turn this county into her personal kingdom. Mrs. Henderson leaned closer and lowered her voice. "There's rumors she's got her sights set on running for county judge next election." That's when it all made sense. Margaret wasn't just trying to steal my land for the money, though I'm sure that was part of it. She was trying to establish herself as the kind of person who could take on established families and win. She was building her political resume by destroying mine. Mrs. Henderson, hypothetically speaking, if someone had senior water rights that predated a development, what would happen to that development if the water went away? She looked at me for a long moment, and I saw something like understanding in her eyes. Hypothetically, those houses would be worthless. Nobody's going to pay premium prices for lakefront property when there's no lake. I gathered up my papers and headed home with my mind racing. I had the legal ammunition I needed, but I also knew that going through official channels would take years and cost money I didn't have. The Hartwells had too many people in their pocket, too much influence with the county bureaucracy. If I was going to stop this, I needed to think like a Mitchell. My great-great-grandfather hadn't asked permission to build that dam in 1889. He'd seen what needed to be done, and he'd done it. Consequences be damned. That evening, I drove out to the dam for the first time since this whole mess started. It was a simple concrete structure, about 8 feet high and 30 feet across, built into a natural choke point where Willow Creek flowed between two rocky hills. Over the years, brush and small trees had grown up around it, making it almost invisible from the development side of the lake. The dam had two features that my great-great-grandfather had insisted on: a main spillway that could be opened or closed with a hand-cranked wheel mechanism, and an emergency overflow channel that would prevent the dam from being damaged in flood conditions. I stood there in the fading daylight, looking at that wheel mechanism, and realized I was holding the key to everything. Margaret Hartwell thought she was so smart, thought she'd found all the angles and covered all the bases. But she'd made one crucial mistake. She'd never bothered to find out who actually controlled the water. I spent that night doing research online, reading everything I could find about Texas water law and dam operations. What I learned convinced me that my plan could work, but it would have to be done carefully, and it would have to be done soon. The new homeowners were planning some kind of big community celebration for the 4th of July weekend, just 6 weeks away. According to the HOA newsletter that someone had left in my mailbox, probably Margaret's idea of psychological warfare, they were expecting over 200 people for the first annual Lake Margaret Independence Day Festival. Margaret herself was listed as the keynote speaker, planning to give a speech about community values and responsible development right there on the shore of my family's lake. The irony was too perfect to pass up. I made my decision that night, sitting on my porch with a glass of my daddy's bourbon and watching the lights from those stolen houses reflect off the water. I was going to let Margaret have her festival, let her invite all her friends and political allies and potential voters to witness her moment of triumph. And then I was going to show them all what happens when you try to build your kingdom on someone else's land. But first, I needed to make sure I had everything documented, everything legal, and everything ready for the confrontation that was coming. Because once I turned that wheel, there would be no going back. What I didn't expect was that Margaret Hartwell had one more card to play, a card that would force me to choose between my family's legacy and my own freedom. A CT4 SHOWDOWN. 3 days before the 4th of July festival, they came for me. I was in my kitchen, making coffee, when I saw the sheriff's cars coming up my driveway. 4 of them, plus an unmarked sedan that I recognized as belonging to the county attorney's office. My stomach dropped like a stone. Sheriff Davidson stepped out of the lead car, along with 2 deputies and a woman in a business suit who looked like she'd rather be anywhere else on earth. They approached the porch with the kind of careful precision that meant this was official business. "Mrs. Mitchell," Sheriff Davidson called out, "we need to speak with you about some serious allegations that have been made." I set my coffee cup down and stepped outside, trying to keep my voice steady. "What kind of allegations?" The woman in the suit spoke up. "I'm Assistant County Attorney Rebecca Walsh. We've received reports that you've been making threats against members of the Riverside Estates community, specifically Mrs. Margaret Hartwell." "Threats? What threats?" Deputy Williams, who I'd known since high school, looked uncomfortable as he consulted his notebook. "Mrs. Hartwell filed a complaint yesterday claiming that you approached her at the grocery store and told her you were going to wash her and her fake houses right off your land. She says you seemed agitated and potentially dangerous." I stared at him in disbelief. "I haven't spoken to Margaret Hartwell since that barbecue party 6 weeks ago. I haven't even been to the grocery store this week." "She also provided us with this," Attorney Walsh said, holding up a plastic evidence bag containing what looked like a handwritten note. "She claims you left this on her car windshield." I took the bag and read the note through the plastic. It was written in block letters on lined paper, YOUSTOLAM, YLAND. NOW, I'm GOINGTOT, a KAATB, a CK. W a T, CHTA jubble, U a TER. "I didn't write this," I said immediately. "This isn't my handwriting, and I sure as hell wouldn't be stupid enough to put threats in writing." "Nevertheless," Attorney Walsh continued, "given the contentious nature of your ongoing property dispute and considering Mrs. Hartwell's concerns about potential violence, we need to discuss some precautionary measures." Sheriff Davidson stepped forward, and I could see the apology in his eyes even before he spoke. "Sarah, I'm sorry about this, but we're going to need you to surrender any firearms you might have on the property. Just temporarily until we can sort this whole thing out." The blood drained from my face. "You're disarming me? Based on some bullshit complaint from Margaret Hartwell?" "It's a standard precaution in cases involving potential domestic terrorism," Attorney Walsh said coldly. "Domestic terrorism?" My voice cracked on the words. "Lady, I'm a rancher trying to protect my family's land. What the hell is domestic about terrorism? Threats against multiple families, statements about taking back property that legally belongs to others, references to water-related violence. She shrugged like it was obvious. The pattern fits. As the deputies searched my house and confiscated my hunting rifles and my father's service pistol, I realized what Margaret had done. She'd manufactured this whole confrontation to neutralize me right before her big festival. While I was dealing with legal proceedings and trying to prove my innocence, she'd have her celebration, cement her political image, and probably announce her candidacy for county judge. But as they were loading my guns into their cars, Deputy Williams lingered on the porch. "Sarah," he said quietly, "this whole thing stinks to high heaven. But I want you to know if you really are planning something, don't do it. She's got too many connections, too much protection. You'll just end up in prison, and she'll still have your land." I looked at him for a long moment, then nodded. "Thanks for the warning, Jimmy." After they left, I sat in my empty house and tried to think. Margaret had outmaneuvered me again, using the system to tie my hands just when I needed them most. The festival was in 3 days. In 3 days, she'd stand on the shore of my family's lake and declare victory over the Mitchell family legacy, unless I could find another way. That night, I drove out to the dam again. The moon was full, casting silver light across the water and the rows of identical houses that lined the shore. I could see lights in most of the windows, families settling in for the night in their stolen paradise. I stood there for a long time, my hand resting on that wheel mechanism, thinking about my great-great-grandfather and what he would do in this situation. James Mitchell had built this dam with his own hands, had fought drought and flood and economic hardship to create something lasting for his family. He'd trusted that future generations of Mitchells would be strong enough to protect what he'd built. But standing there in the moonlight, I felt anything but strong. I felt tired and overwhelmed and completely outgunned by an enemy who seemed to have all the advantages. That's when I heard the footsteps behind me. I spun around, expecting to see a deputy or another one of Margaret's flunkies, but instead I found myself face to face with an elderly man I'd never seen before. He was tall and thin, with white hair and wearing clothes that looked like they belonged on a ranch hand from 50 years ago. "You're James Mitchell's great-great-granddaughter," he said. It wasn't a question. "Who's asking?" "Name's William Garrett. My granddaddy worked for yours back in the early 1900s. Helped build this dam, actually." He stepped closer, and I could see his eyes were the same pale blue as the lake. "I've been watching what that Hartwell woman's been doing to you. Thought you might like to know something about her that she probably doesn't want getting out." I waited, hardly daring to breathe. Margaret Hartwell isn't who she says she is. Real name's Margaret Kowalski, from a little town outside Pittsburgh. She came to Texas after her first husband died in a car accident, an accident that left her with a $2 million insurance settlement and a lot of questions about how exactly his brakes failed on a straight road in good weather. My blood chilled. "Are you saying she killed her husband?" "I'm saying she's got a pattern. Rich husband dies in suspicious circumstances. She moves to a new state, marries another wealthy man, starts building political connections. She tried the same thing in Arizona before Texas, but the locals there got wise to her game, and she had to move on." He reached into his jacket and pulled out a manila envelope. "Everything's in here. Police reports from Pennsylvania, newspaper articles from Arizona, financial records showing how she's been moving money around to hide her tracks. Took me 3 months to put it all together, but I figured you deserve to know what you're really up against." I took the envelope with trembling hands. "Why are you helping me?" William Garrett smiled, and for a moment he looked almost ghostly in the moonlight. "Because this land matters. Because some things are worth fighting for, even when the fight seems impossible. And because Margaret Hartwell made one crucial mistake when she decided to go to war with the Mitchell family. What mistake? She forgot that we Texas folks have long memories and longer reach. She thought she could reinvent herself here, thought nobody would bother to dig into her past. His smile turned cold. She was wrong. As he walked away, dissolving back into the shadows as quietly as he'd appeared, I opened the envelope and started reading by moonlight. What I found there changed everything. Margaret Hartwell, or Margaret Kowalski, wasn't just a greedy HOA president looking to make a quick profit. She was a serial predator who had been using marriage, murder, and political manipulation to build wealth and power across multiple states. The insurance settlement from her first husband's death had been the seed money for her land development schemes. Her marriage to Robert Hartwell was just the latest step in a pattern that stretched back over 15 years. But the most damaging information was about her financial arrangements. She'd been systematically defrauding the county by inflating construction costs on her husband's contracts and funneling the excess money into offshore accounts. She'd also been using HOA